Greetings, everyone. This is Caroline Staten with Transition US, and thank you so much for joining our call today with Fred Brown, and I will introduce him shortly. I just wanted to mention a few things before we begin. This call is sponsored by Transition US, which is a national hub of the Transition Network, now in over 50 countries. And more information can be found at transitionus.org. And our principal aim in providing these events is to support the leaders of transition initiatives, those who are considering starting a transition initiative, and community leaders across the country and in other countries who are working on resilience building within their locales. And we want to continue to offer these at no cost, and do ask that you consider making a donation to Transition US. And we have a donation button on our website at transitionus.org. And thank you so much for any of you who are able to support us in that way. And let me introduce Fred to you and the topic of today. And then we'll take a few questions then before Fred begins, just to get a sense for him. What are the expectations that some of you have? What are your concerns and your interests, so that he can help focus his presentation? So we'll just take 3 questions at that time, but let me introduce Fred and the topic. So our topic today that Fred will be covering is how transition towns can bridge the urban community with the global economy using principles of economic gardening, which is a strength-based approach to community development that spans socioeconomic strata. So that's the overview of today's topic, and Fred's going to cover a lot of ground. And Fred Brown is an environmental justice leader specializing in green urban revitalization. He currently serves as president and CEO of Homewood Children's Village, a community development organization which takes a 2-generation approach to improving the lives of children and adults in the Homewood neighborhood of Pittsburgh. And in 2011, Fred's Urban Leadership Institute was awarded the SAVIT Award for Best Practices for a resident-to-resident model for energy reduction. And he's also used the block-by-block neighborhood energy challenge to reduce neighborhood energy use. And Fred was selected to represent the state of Pennsylvania on the President's Federal Climate Change MOU as a member of the Environmental Justice National Roundtable. So Fred has been a long-time climate justice trainer, environmental justice leader, policy analyst, adjunct professor, dean of students, teacher, coach, mentor, certified juvenile justice judges trainer, certified conflict mediation resolution trainer, master consultant, supervisor, director, and executive director of nonprofit organizations. And Fred is also a transition trainer and has taught transition courses as well. So Fred, that's a lot of things that you've accomplished. You also have a BS in education from Indiana University, an MSW from the University of Pittsburgh, and a doctoral candidate in social work, I guess, from the University of Pittsburgh. So that's definitely a lot of ground, and we're absolutely delighted to have you here today with us. And I just did want to remind people we wanted to hear from 3 people. That's what we're thinking. who have can basically. What are your interests? What would you like Fred to cover today? So press 1 on your keypad if you can come up with, your expectations or concern or something. Joel, you've pressed something on your keypad. Can I call on you? Joel Metzger? Maybe not. Let's see. Let's go to Nicole Nicoletta, please. Let us know.
Yes, hi there.
Hi.
Hi, Fred. Hi, Carolyn. So hopefully this is applicable. I know I will learn plenty from you regardless. But what I live in a little town called Manitou Springs. It's in Colorado. I'm currently the mayor. We are a tourist-based economy. We have a new influx over the past couple of years of a lot of youth homelessness. We're surrounded by mountains, and we have old mining and railroad caves. So we have a lot of youth camping in the woods, camping in the hills. My balance and tricky piece as the mayor is to try to find a way to address the homelessness, not only the homelessness, but the panhandling that occurs in our downtown business district in a way that is respectful to the youth and to the folks who are hanging out on the street because they have every right to be there, and also being mindful of the businesses who are saying that the presence of these youth are creating negative impact to their business. So I'm trying not to over-regulate with ordinances and policies and those sorts of things to try to mitigate the problem. I'd rather include these youth. I'd rather include the folks who are hanging out. So anything I can, any information or ideas for that would be great.
No problem. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Any other interests or ideas, explorations? Press 1 on your keypad. Marissa, go ahead.
Hi, Fred.
Hello.
I'm very interested in hearing more about some of the job creation programs that you were involved with in Larimer. I know I remember you mentioning it a bit to me when I came and visited you, but I think a lot of us are interested in green, transition-oriented job creation. Sounds like it could be of interest to our last speaker too, so I'd love to hear more about that in particular.
Will do.
Great, thank you.
And we don't have any other hands up right now. I'll just ask once again if someone does want to chime in with, here we go, we've got someone else. Ella, go ahead.
Yes, I'm actually interested in hearing about job creation and I guess creating a livelihood in light of the changing demographics, in particular those of us over the age of 50.
Great, thank you very much, Ella, for that. So, Fred, that's
Thank you.
That's some of them, and I know, Fred, you and I talked beforehand that periodically you'll possibly want to stop and ask for some more questions and find out what other interests are popping up for people. Over to you, Fred. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Caroline. This has been great. I want to thank everybody for taking this opportunity to spend some time with us on the teleseminar. I'm honored to be in this position and humbled by this opportunity. And I just want to let everybody know I'll be going through some of the slides specifically and in general. If there's anything that people have a burning question about when we get to, I'll pause that several times during the presentation. At that point, we can do the same thing Caroline has done with 1 or 2 or 3 questions so that we can drill a little deeper into those areas. I want to first say that Transition Towns has changed my life. I was honored to be exposed to a woman named Tina Clark many years ago who's been my mentor and partner in my evolution through Transition Towns, and actually created a hybrid opportunity for me to be part of international movement. I really like the impetus of Transition Towns and had the honor of working directly with Naresh and Sophie when they came to the States a few times, and actually deepening my understanding of the focus of Transition Towns and its desire to look at our carbon footprint and reduce our exposure to toxins. So I have had an interesting journey, and this Transition Towns have kind of put all of that into some sequence for me. I think the most compelling thing about the slides as I go through the slides, and I just wanted to really define in a general sense what Transition Towns has meant to me. It's really this notion that you can take a geographical area and shrink it down to about a 3-mile radius and create a growth opportunity that has economic stability laid in it as a result of the natural assets in that particular community. Totnes in 2006 was the first demonstrated UK city that demonstrated this notion of self-sufficiency while looking at people and climate change. So it's 12 ingredients that really make up the notion of Transition Town, really served as a framework for some things I was already doing in Larimer in the city of Pittsburgh. So when I met Tina, she said to me, you should become a trainer for Transition Towns. My first response was, I don't have time for that. Like, I'm too busy doing what I'm doing. But after a few hours meeting with Tina, she convinced me that I should definitely take a deeper look into this. Caroline mentioned earlier that my journey started before I met Tina. I'm actually with Dr. Robert Bullard, who some of us consider the father of environmental justice. I was instrumental in working with him on a national level, and we happened to work with, at that time, President Bush's Science Department on the reauthorization of the Transportation Equity Act, TLEW. And I worked with a group called TEN, the Transportation Equity Network. And in Pittsburgh, I was able to use indigenous research methodology to obtain over 5,000 community contacts on various issues that had impacts at the community level that we used to drive policy that we ended up crafting for, at that time it was President Bush's council that they ended up using in the reauthorization. At that same time, I was identified by the Ford Foundation as a 21st century environmental justice leader, and they sent me to San Francisco to be trained in that. And while I was there, I started something called, co-sponsored something called the Environmental Justice Institute and the Youth Policy Institute, where I trained urban kids in indigenous research methodology, and we taught them how to challenge public policies by bringing in experts from around the country who actually taught them how government worked and how social efficacy could change their circumstances despite how old they were. So what I fell in love with about Transition Towns was this notion that it's a grassroots initiative. It looks at building on community resiliency. This notion of people and climate change was new to me, but not the issues that were confronting my community of crime, unemployment, low education, assessment and accountability with regards to familiar practices. So Transition Towns also offered to me, at least in my mind's eye, a notion of how can we rebuild community centers from a grassroots initiative that really honored people's assets and didn't focus on deficits. So during my early journey in the Transition Towns training, I found myself compelled as I presented around the country that I was often the only person of color in the room, and people had been deeply embedded into this resiliency model that was tied into transition towns and looking at people and climate change issues. And I met with Naresh and Sophie and Tina, and I said, hey, I think this is a great idea. I love it to death, but is there a way that we can put some more cultural competency guidelines in the work? I'm really finding it difficult to convey this message to the populations I serve. And, after several conversations and a year or two of working in transition towns in 2012, when Naresh and Sophie came back to the States, they facilitated a training in Chicago called Thrive, and I was participatory in that, and they asked me to help design some cultural competency components, which I did. And in return, I asked them a favor. I said, I really love this model. Would you guys support me developing a different model that would be more applicable to the populations I serve? They honored my wish. They asked me to just acknowledge that my philosophy and program emerged out of transition towns, which I do, and I created something 4 years ago called Urban Transition Cities Movement, and it was based upon the economic gardening principles and how we can look at local assets. We incorporated some of the 12 elements of transition towns, but we don't hold as closely to the original model. We've more or less developed a co-design approach that looks at the interfacing of micro, meso, and macro systems in which we link up in a vertical and horizontal way to address social phenomena, recognizing that as vulnerable people in particular identify risks and challenges, more often than not, they require the support of other systems to tweak, turn, or adjust or recalibrate their ability to address that issue. So I found it more beneficial to bring all of those people together at one time to hear the community's concerns and interests and ideas, and then to formulate co-design methodologies that explored mitigating or arresting those issues that both grow what I would call the collective genius of the community and of the practitioners. So we formed transformational leadership models that utilized for us in Pittsburgh. I have to tell you a little bit about my community and the ones I serve. In my last job at the Kingsley Association, which is now I think 125 years old, I was responsible for serving 44 zip codes in the city of Pittsburgh, managing a 56,000 square foot facility that had an annual usage rates of 160,400 people that came through it annually, with median incomes that ranged between $10,000 and $200,000 a year, which was unique for me to manage a facility of that kind. More recently, the work that I did there was awarded in 2014 with a $30 million Choice HUD award as a result of a Choice Neighborhood effort that was driven from a economic gardening principles with community residents that are poor and disenfranchised that HUD was impressed with because they were able to articulate what is the utilizations and applications of eco-districts and how they would be of benefit to this particular community. So over the last several years, I became adept at eco-districts frameworks and learned how to look at environmental racism from a different lens, and looked at this notion of neoliberalism and liberalism. And basically, we're looking at these practices that even in places where people seek to do better and create equitable opportunities, we have a dynamic occurring in America where the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And right now, my last analysis was 20% of America's population controls 93% of America's wealth. So you have 80% of the country subsiding on 7% of the wealth. And I struggled with that as I started to embrace transition towns and some of the activity that comes from it, because I was trying to figure out, how do you create a tipping point if the people with resources really don't see themselves as being responsible for helping other vulnerable people be participatory in changing the issues affecting the world. So I spent a lot of time trying to use language and practices that help people evolve and understand the benefits of social change and social equity. So I've worked with practitioners that work with Martin Luther King. I traveled the country and met with his theorists, his strategists. I spent weeks and months with them to really try to get an understanding of what it is that they did, what were they thinking, what was their thought process, what was their desired outcomes. I moved back to Pittsburgh and started to look at local heroes and sheroes, and started to work with Dr. Ron Peters, who was the director of urban ministries that was at the Urban Institute in the city of Pittsburgh at the Theological Seminary. And he basically really helped me understand and look at the spheres of influence between the urban ministry regarding the parish and the public, which I find to be a dichotomy because my experience in the church has always been that it's been about the body of people and not the physical buildings that are created. However, we've had a paradigm shift in America where it seems to be more prudent to build a giant building and have people come from all around the city to worship in, and to not look at how those transactions run over and often mitigate local residents' ability to benefit from the emergence of the church in those type of industries. So I set about a course to really challenge urban ministry and partner with him on ways that the urban ministry can leave its perches and really become more of a public entity to interface at a grassroots level. So, my journey has been rooted in 3 or 4 critical people who influenced my life. Peggy Shepherd, who's in New York, who runs WEAC. WEAC, it stands for WEAC for Environmental Justice in Harlem. Dr. Robert Bullard, who I found she and he to be some of the original architects of the environmental justice movement. And Majora Carter, who I've had some time to spend with and work with over the years, who really helped to shape some of my thinking around opportunities, as well as share with me some of the things that she thought were critical for a movement, in particular with involving people of color to be more centrally involved with how they play their role. So this notion of growing organizational leadership really started with people having the ability to look at and see a vision for themselves, find and construct leadership, honor the importance of scholarship, and look at innovation as a game changer. And then for me, what's always critical is what's our praxis? What is our way of measuring success? So I've had the opportunity to present around the country and the world and use structuring of the community platform in a way that expands it from just Pittsburgh to a global context. I currently sit on the mayor's Affordable Housing Task Force, I'm a planning commissioner for the city of Pittsburgh. I sit on the planning, the briefing for 100 Resilient Cities. I also work with the P4 conference and work in Pittsburgh. And really I'm trying to get the ship to pivot to really look at if the focus of these efforts are to strengthen vulnerable communities to be able to deal with stressors and shocks that are directly correlated to climate change, how are we both educating people about the risk and also creating opportunities for them to have hands-on learnings, opportunities that deepen their understanding of the risk. So I represent a community that has, and this is important to discern, in the 1930s it had 41,000 people in it. Today it has 6,442 people. In my last job in Larimer, I worked in a community that had 30,000 people, and now it has 1,700. And I attribute both of those communities, they represent the two poorest census tracts in the city of Pittsburgh, but they also represent the two flattest land masses with vacant land on. So I'm concerned now about the impact of gentrification. So I'm moving to a slide that says Greenburgh, Kansas, and it represents, and this looks like slide, I don't know, 11 or something.
I think 13.
Slide 13, thank you.
Yeah.
It basically looks at a natural tornado and what happens, as a result of that. If you go to the next slide, this is Larimer. So in the last few years, it went down to 13,000 families, and now it's down to 1,700. And this is what it looks like as a result of 30 years of disinvestment. So for me, I looked at the two slides and I was saying, wow, this looks like a natural disaster, but it's man-made. What was the reasoning for that? And how come it's being ignored? What is being done about it? Which really got me thinking about, I actually used to go to school near this particular community, and when I rode by, caught the bus, or rode my bike to school, this was a very thriving and vibrant community, and now it's been decimated. So for me today, I've been saying, okay, what can we do differently that can change the circumstances and situations? And transition time for me was that thing that really spoke to my heart and said, we can actually do something different if we look at what's going on around the world and say, what are the best practices from that? So what would a post-carbon future look like? What would be some of the things that we're doing together as a community? How would houses look? How would people get around? So I've been really looking at this notion that Einstein talks about, and it's promoting collective genius. And he says something that imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited. Imagination encircles the world. So in this next slide where we're talking about promoting collective genius, over a year and a half time, this community, Larimer, which I used to work in, looked like that, and it thought about itself becoming a new green destination. And on that slide to the right, you see their ideas that percolated as a result of a land use study and market study. So if you can see in this slide, we're talking about the development of green space, a village green space, an urban garden, a neighborhood retail area, the use of light industrial frameworks to rebuild the infrastructure, and the use of the busway and the tread to really promote federal investments and local investments. And this was their first idea, and I was privileged to work on them from this iteration to the fourth iteration. So in the 1940s, there were 13,350 people in Larimer. Now it's 1,700. The new ecological footprint is 6,500. So I've been working through this notion called eco districts that looks at how does Larimer pivot? What are the things that it can do? So we looked at how you stabilize the community, how you grow economic security, how you diversify and increase resiliency, and how do you sustain and maintain the vibrancy. So we came up with this mixture of, if we recreate the community based upon the new ecological footprint, and there's currently 1,700 people in the population, if we create a third and a third and a third mix to get to 6,500 or so, how could we do that strategically? So we've used a vacant land strategy to look at what was available by public and private use. We work with the City of Pittsburgh's URA, the City of Pittsburgh's Mayor's Office to really figure out how we capture that land and secure it for the community. Then we work with the URA to design and enhance the community's visions to look at what the other opportunities could look like. Looking at mixed income communities, we looked at scattered site development. We looked at the reuse of creating an athletic center where universities and schools could share the space and actually pull people in to somewhat make it a cultural destination. Then as we started to look at this work, I worked with some developers around the world. It was an open source project. We designed something called Imagine Larimer, and it's a web-based software that's on the Google Earth platform that we basically created using a touchscreen smart board, in which, and you can see it if you're looking at this slide 20, it has a diagram with a bullseye on it, and basically we created a platform. If you look to the left, there's a tree, and if you pulled the tree down into the platform, it will light up where the greatest density is to put the tree to have an impact on CO2 emissions. So we were trying to create natural barriers to capture and mitigate CO2 emissions as a way of creating a safeguard to offset exposure to PM10 and PM2.5 air particulate matter. We also looked at this notion that if you look to the right of that particular screen, there's an info card, and you can't see it in great detail, but on the info card we had, for every information that you pulled down on the screen, it had a ROI, what the rate of return on investment is. It would have a contact person or name, a website for where you can get this information, what we propose the annual ROI would be, and then what would be a number or aggregate to really create change. So we tried to take a scientific process, make it very transformational and user-friendly, and we used the smartboard technology so that we can have intergenerational trainings take place that allowed the seniors in the community to work closely with the youth in the community and tie it together. And that moved us into a deeper understanding of eco-districts. So my work really started to say, if you look at the economic gardening principles, what does that mean in practicality? So I had to start looking at what were the assets and challenges in the city of Pittsburgh. One of them is that we get 67 days of sunshine a year. Okay, everybody don't laugh, just pause and take that in, but that's the truth. And we have to figure out, like, how do you manage and live in a healthy way with only 67 days of sunshine a year? And we basically created some diagrams that looked at if we can capture stormwater and reuse it and reduce its impact in the system, is that a cost savings? Does that change the atmosphere and energy use? Do we preserve things that happen? And this was catalytic for us because in 2012, or maybe it was 2010, either between 2010 and 2012, there was a flash flood in Pittsburgh and several people got killed. And it became apparent to the city and the county that there was an issue, and the first thing the city and the county did was talk about allocating $1 million to create a bar, like a train crossing bar that stopped motorists from going down the road when there was a hard rain. And I just found that to be like a not good use of resource. I was like, is there a different thing that we can do that this doesn't have us reacting to the issue, but can it be more proactive? So we started to work on this eco-districts process and focused on three things. Because there is over 5,000 vacant lands and properties in Homewood and Larimer, could we look at the utilization of those lands to create a solar farm to produce energy? Could we actually take Larimer off the grid? Could we capture enough stormwater to reduce the runoff and actually reuse that water in productive ways? And could we possibly monetize that? So I work with a lot of very bright people, and we also looked at this notion of creating an urban farm to create local food production. So I'm thinking systematically now. I'm thinking about all of the systems that have to work congruently to create systemic change, how they have to interface, and what is the ROI, what is the things that they will mitigate. So we worked long and hard on that. And I was blessed to work with some hydrologists, Ian Linsky, some architects, Christine Mondor, a number of other people, but people who really got the nuts and bolts of the work that we did, but also the value of the people that we work with. So we created a number of projects that moved into how do you train people at the grassroots level, some who are homeless, some who are jobless, some who are untrainable. How do you work with that kind of population when the technical proficiency of this particular model requires you to have some level of expertise? So I designed a intergenerational and cross-discipline approach in which I hired experts in the field to work hand in hand with local residents that we identified to really transfer a seminal level of knowledge to them about what it is they do and what their expertise was, and also concurrently what are the skill sets needed to do this work. So I designed something called the Urban Leadership Institute, and I trained 15 to 20 community residents at a time. And the first set of people we trained to become certified, BPI certified energy auditors. So my hypothesis was that if we train these individuals, they can actually go into the community, start to weatherize their homes, and we can create a counter narrative to stabilize the community, reduce gentrification by helping low-income people have a greener blueprint of their house construct and actually have them use less resources to pay for their everyday heating, cooling, and things like that. My hypothesis was flawed, however. When we went into the houses, they were in such deplorable condition because of the 30 and 40 years of disinvestment that the houses couldn't take $5,000 to $10,000 of investment to make whole. On average, they took 15 to 20, which exceeded our budget allotment for the project. So I had to rethink our work, rethink how we might go about doing it, build new practitioners. So I created another training project that looked at if we train community residents in basic construction skills and we work with local agencies to mitigate risks, could we then begin to create a transferable process by which people learn green sustainable principles through hands-on practices that also informed and alerted and pricked their consciousness around how they can better impact the environment. So Caroline mentioned earlier we got an award from Penn Futures for the most innovative peer-to-peer energy reduction model. And I have to tell you, 85% of the time we were doing the project, we never talked about the carbon footprint. We never talked about how this would impact the world. We focused and reverse engineered the process to a simple equation. How much money is this going to save you? That spoke to the vulnerable people that we work with. And it was at that point that people resonated around the idea. It was at that point that they started to dig deeper into it. And as we got through the project and people started to learn practical applications that could reduce their energy use, their carbon footprint as a result of cross-pollination of the experiences and learning, people began to realize, like, I really like this idea. I really like eco-districts. I really like this work. And then they began to dive deeper into wanting to learn more about the work. And that was really the premise was for people who are surviving, it's very difficult, and this was the challenge I had with transition towns. For people who I work with that are surviving, when I go into a room and talk about their carbon footprint, that's a foreign concept. Even though I feel like low-income and vulnerable people are great contributors to our carbon footprint because they unknowingly and unconsciously live a lifestyle that is consistent with not using energy in a positive and productive way. And it's not because they're doing it intentionally, it's because they don't know. So how do we create ways without judging people that we can create a learning environment where every time they learn something, it piques their interest to learn more while pricking their conscience to understand that we only have one planet that we're living on and we're killing it. And so we did that, I think, in a very graceful way. The other thing that I was blessed with being able to do was I designed something called EJCAM, the Environmental Justice Community Alert Matrix, and I was able to partner with universities in the city of Pittsburgh, work out partnerships with them to bring on PhD students who can actually dig deeper and look at the air quality issues, energy production issues, and really for a 5-year commitment be the intellectual property and guards for the community, really bringing good ideas and practices. So we use the Gray Wolf machine, Spec Monitor, to do analysis on construction sites, new constructions, to look at VOC exposures, ambient air qualities, and really try to create a framework for what would be a healthy environment to move a family into, and what are some external locus of controls that may be contributing to an unhealthy environment. So we looked at this through a very comprehensive lens. We worked with a lot of different partners, and we really tried to keep the focus on how do you promote people to be self-sufficient. So the use of urban transition cities movements, which once again I have to say emerged out of transition towns, really looked at the pivot and how we changed the trajectory of T for T in this traditional sense to this morphed or organic or iterative thing that worked in the community in what I would call the concrete jungle. And we looked at the cross-pollination of the historical constructs of T for T. It's 12 steps, focusing on beginning with your own demise, looking at, how, predominantly non-people of color, really move this movement around the world. And then how does support and let it go work in people who have already been disenfranchised? So we had to actually consider all of the metaphysical applications of that approach and really say we probably don't have to do it different. So we talked about addressing the issue of vulnerability in transit populations. So I serve a system now that's 1 square mile. My team serves 1,100 kids a day in 3 schools. In those 2 to 3 schools, we got 43% mobility issue. We serve 20% of all of the homeless kids in one particular school district. We have twice the national asthma rate, which we know there's 14 million cases a year annually, and our small 1 square mile has twice that amount. So what are the possibilities of addressing a kid's academic trajectory if they have these barriers in the way? So transition towns really forced me to look at, if we're going to be successful, what are the ways we reduce those stressors and barriers? So we're looking at creating annual benchmarks. How do you empower vulnerable communities to take responsibility for their lives? How you pair them up with other people to build relationships that deepen their understanding of the technical work needed to change the process, and how do we sensitize technical people's understanding of the conditions we find vulnerable people in. And that was very important to me because from the outside looking in, people look at a vulnerable community and some people surmise that they're poor people, they don't care, they're lazy, they're shiftless. But when you start looking at the fact, okay, that poor community has a lead issue, both in water and in the air, in the homes. We know that lead has a physiological impact on the body. It shrinks the brain. It messes with the receptors. It does damage to your ability to learn. So now when I start looking at these vulnerable communities, I don't look at them as so much a victim, but I look at them as being victimized by an uncaring system who is willing to purport that they are shiftless and lazy as a result of disinvestment. So I guess you could say, I'm always highly charged about that because the community I'm now working in, my mother still lives in and I grew up in. I went to school and I graduated from high school in it. I went to college, I taught school here, and I went around the world from the very same community that people look at with dismay. And I don't feel like I'm an anomaly. I feel like I'm just one of the people that stayed in Pittsburgh or came back. A lot of my friends are doing well all around the country and the world. They just left Pittsburgh. So if you look at Darwinism and you look at the extrapolation of DNA from a cell to create a supercell, America, to me, has created these a hybrid dynamics where they take the best and brightest people and move them away from different places to create safe and healthier communities. But as a result of that, you actually create a dichotomy because now there's not an equilibrium. People are in a position to survive by any means necessary, and you promote a dichotomy because people begin to use different language to convey their struggles. They have less success. They begin to internalize this dynamic, and they begin to point the finger and blame others. So our work has been evolving to really promote this thing called collective genius. And I keep referring to Einstein. He's a hero for me because I really believe when he talks about we cannot solve a problem with the same thinking we use when we created them, which means to me that Einstein is challenging all of us to look at our relationships with one another so that we begin to operate at a different frequency. Because we trust each other, we put our guards down. Once our guards go down, our ability to collaborate goes up. Once our ability to collaborate goes up, I think, this is just my hypothesis, we promote collective genius because we begin to share and trust one another at a different frequency that we begin to see the world from different vantage points. We don't become omnipotent, but we do become more able to look across socioeconomic strata and see multiple ways of resolving a problem that heretofore we could not see through our own lens. How does the learning that we have had in Pittsburgh and other places, how do we connect that to Penn State, other places around the community and the country and the world who are having similar challenges and issues? So I will say that I think one of the reasons that we've been successful is that we continue to look at this through an iterative process, meaning that it's evolving. We never look at it as a stagnant thing. We look at it as an evolving thing. I'm remiss to say that the success that I talk about is not me by myself. There's a group of people who believe in me, trust me, support me, challenge me to continuously refine myself. So when you met me in 2010, I was an embryo building this whole journey, and I was off in a direction that I thought was pertinent to the work. But as I started to get into it and understand transition towns, I began to realize that how do we pull together the best practices in a particular geographical location and really work on that and then expand it in a very pragmatic way. And I think we've been successful because we do a block-by-block approach, we do a community-by-community approach, and then we created something in 2009 when I was at the Kingsley called the Urban Green Growth Collaborative. And it was comprised of, when I stopped working with it, there was 150 nonprofit organizations involved and 1,500 national and international followers. And basically I went to a meeting one day, and the people who convened the meeting convened it specifically for what they wanted. And I sat there and I said, why am I in this meeting? I keep raising my hand, asking questions, and they won't answer my questions. So I just took people's cards at the meeting and left and said, I'm going to offer people to come to a meeting and open up the meeting to answer any and all questions. So in 2009, I hosted a meeting called UGGC, Urban Green Growth Collaborative, and basically it was based upon green sustainable principles. What are the things that we can help communities that are struggling with learn about themselves so they can be participatory in the new global economy? And what about the businesses that were interested in that work? How many of those businesses would be willing to collaborate and partner to really make a difference, so that we were looking at our resources in their aggregate matter and say, I only got $10 theoretically, you got $7, you got $4, how can we take $21 and make a bigger impact than we could with 10, 7, and 4? So I really tried to promote this thing that didn't involve us asking for more money from foundations and private donors, but to really realign the existing resources we did have in a more pragmatic and seamless way. And also encompassed in that was this notion that we need to have some level of accountability. So we cannot just be, people who have a good idea and really want to do good work. How do we go about creating a measurable objective through accountability across these domains? Which is why, and I'll try to start defining some of these terms. When I say micro, meso, and macro, I'm really referring to the service delivery system. At the micro level, I'm talking about one-to-one relationships that you have with people on the ground. At the meso level, we're talking about self-help and community and non-profit organizations that have some responsibility, right, in their mission to serve people at some level of capacity. And then at the macro level, we're talking about universities and institutions and governmental agencies that have an obligation to educate, protect, and inform citizens to keep them safe. And what I've realized over the years of doing this work, all of those systems function in parallel tracks that very seldom interface. So what I attempted to do was figure out a better way to look at what I would call the vertical and horizontal integration of those systems so that we can look at the existing resources, get them to work better together, and then to promote some level of accountability. And in doing so, we would drill down on any gaps that existed as a result of us doing that work together. So we would stop assuming that people were doing all these things and really drill down on what people did better than anything else. And that really moves me into, this Hedgehog Concept, which I adopted from Jim Collins' work on Good to Great. And I've tried to look at what is the simplicity within the three circles. What are people passionate about? What is their purpose? And what does it produce? So I really tried to take transition towns in this original construct and decompose it or deconstruct it so that it was more organic in the urban setting and more simplistic. And for me, I was trying to realize that people needed to be able to have their basic needs met. And how could we create programs that met people's basic needs while also increasing their IQs around the problems that we know are right around the corner? And, between transition towns and eco district, it really allowed us as a city or a small community to pivot. And in that pivot, we began to look at what does creating a living city look like versus urban redevelopment. And I want to pause there and say, historically, a lot of the work that's taking place in Pittsburgh right now, we had a resurgence in the last few years of new development, 3%, 9% tax credits, Choice Neighborhoods Award. These things really are catalytic, but I'm worried that some of them are just transactional activity and not transformational. So we really started focusing on how can we change the narrative of these expected projects and really create this notion of creating a living city. And our work was really focused on, project scale and time required to implement. What's the short term and long term? What are the units and instruments that we need to have involved? Who are key people? And then I refer back to, if we cultivate the micro, meso, and macro systems we've created, we can pull from those systems people and places and things that can help us create a different reality without adding more cost to the system, but just really realigning it. And really the real cost came from somebody being able to coordinate, organize this, and manage it. So we start looking at community capacity. How do you promote effective decision making? How do you promote organizational learning? Is there a need for legal structures? What are the financial resources that are needed? So when we started to look at how does this play out in the urban setting, We looked at the impact of transition towns approach, looking at the Great Unleashing, forum groups, use space, and then in Larimer we looked at the action plan, the vision and action plan. We looked at the development of the consensus group, and we looked at using charrettes and vignettes to create designs that incorporated community members' insights into some open space use that really would get people involved in what I would call low-hanging fruit that really started to capture momentum. The other thing I did was I tried to start to capture volunteer hours of the volunteers based upon an IRS determination, and I calculated that into dollars, because the other challenge in a vulnerable setting in some other communities might be, how does a community without assets come to a table as an equal partner? So we had to begin to tell people that this community has volunteered X amount of hours over X amount of years, and if you look at the IRS determination, it means that they've done this much in dollars and cents. And we use that as a pivot to really change the narrative of our conversations with the developers, with city officials, the mayor, the governor, and really try to look at, here are assets that are being ignored. And then we started to look at this notion of how do we reuse equipment. We did a shipping container project. We did some architectural designs on the project. We brought kids in through our STEAM project and had them work on the project. And we just tried to lay out an idea of what something could look like. We purchased the equipment and materials for people to test pilot these ideas. And then we just continued to cultivate these into project forms that also looked at how does the consensus group in this particular notion really evolve and change to really better inform. We know big ticket projects were coming to Pittsburgh, that this group could be seen as an asset and not a deficit and be part of a learning curve. And I think that transition towns really allowed us to rethink, if we shrink the community down to this 3-mile radius, what are some of the key components that we need in the 21st century in an urban setting that would make that possible? So, unit size, square foot size, aggregate number of units serving aggregate number of people, cultivating a new business district, looking at how we use tax credits to leverage private development. And we really tried to be creative with regards to how we moved these projects along, how we included the community in it, and how we also held the developer and mayor's office and other people accountable. And we really started to understand the company's performers and also what the real cost is to hold up projects. So it was a two-tier process. One is educating and informing the community around what it takes to make real change, and then also sensitizing them to every day that a developer does a project and they're not working, it's costing that company hundreds of thousands of dollars. So a lot of our ideas really had to be pertinent, thought out, and well supported. And, as we moved through this process and learned more and grew and got better, we were the recipients of a $30 million grant in June of 2014. And I'm just going through slides now to kind of give you the visualization of what that looks like when you got a county commissioner, a mayor, you have the community leaders, stakeholders, councilmen, community organizations coming together agreeing on a strategy to change one particular community. And for me, that was very informative and really helped me create the foundation for building bridges towards sustainable community design. And really I started focusing on how do you build transformational organizations and practices, and how do you call out transactional practices that you feel are detrimental to organizational development and community development. So my organization's focus that I'm currently in now, Homewood Children's Village, which derived from Harlem Children's Zone, is really about how do we simultaneously improve the lives of homeless children and to reweave the fabric of the community in which they live, which really says to me the parent is the first teacher, and if the child is in an unhealthy environment, how do we educate the parent in their real life experience? What are the risks that they have and what are they being exposed to? So we begin to do an internal analysis of our project, how many kids we serve, where we serve it, how it's impacting them. Then we start to look at how well are we doing with connecting resources to people, how well are we doing the work outside the school, how are we ensuring that people's lives are being changed. So that gave us this story of homework. So if you create a stable environment, a healthy atmosphere, and you promote the parent as the first teacher in leadership, you can begin to tackle the issues in a particular geographical location. So we start to look at what dynamics existed, how can we look at the population decline, how can we look at the use of something on the ground that we're already working with to really change the notion of our work. And we begin to look at strategic partnerships in Homewood that mirrored the work we did in Larimer and really began to capture how can we create change at a grassroots level that would be sustainable. And we continue to look at the 12 steps of transition, looking at the use of steering committees, raising awareness, laying the foundation to address local challenges, organize the great unleashing, form groups, use open space, develop visible practical projects, look at reskilling, what's the bridge to local government, and then honoring the elders and letting it go where it goes, and then ultimately creating an energy descent plan. And this was something we had to keep going back to so we didn't lose sight of the original traditional transition towns model, but we had to keep recalibrating that to say, how does that work in an urban setting? How does that work with people who've been disenfranchised? So we looked at this notion of our 4 C's. How do we convene people? How do we coordinate resources? How do we build capacity? How do we support the community? And that started us on the new journey of looking at building a sustainable community. And for me, it really started to say that we need to become the architects of something that we currently are not doing. We need to look at intentional relationships, strategic partnerships, having some measure of accountability, and then also creating benchmarks that were measurable. So I looked at President Obama's Act 129 and looked at, okay, here the industry had a requirement to reduce its impact on the grid. This is something that basically is in line and supports the climate change issue. This supports Transition Town's focus, and it also supports moving Transition Town from urban and rural settings into the urban setting, because now we're talking about sustainable futures. How do we look at creating sustainable communities and partnerships? And many Rust Belt cities like Pittsburgh that had experienced a population decline and kind of been gutted and been labeled Rust Belt cities. So we looked at who's benefiting from that and how do we use national and international interests. So that created this opportunity for us to connect with 100 Resilient Cities movements, meeting with the mayor's office. We began to write white papers and briefs and really start to deconstruct some of the best thinking in the city and really utilize our research department to come up with a different set of questions based upon hard data and not anecdotal data. And that really has driven our work to helping to create living cities and really promoting this notion in architects. Could you begin to think about building a building that's iterative, that evolves, that's alive, versus a structure? And what would that look like? And we presented that in D.C. in December at the Eco Districts Conference, and it was well received. A lot of people walked up to me afterwards and were challenged by the notion, but also challenged by what it meant. And for us, it meant, we got to first change the way we think about design. How can we be intentional about building communities where people, by nature, walking out the door are forced to interface with each other differently and not just walk straight to their car? What if they had to walk through a garden, walk by kids, walk by an elderly person pruning their tree? At some point in time, they would have to have some exchanges. And right now, we build communities where people walk out of their house into a car and off to work. They walk back, they get in their car, go back home, walk out of their car, and go into their house. So what if we created neighborhoods where you couldn't do that? You were forced to have some exchange with people every day, and you were forced to look at the things they were doing and toiling about that really got you to look at them from a different context and lens. And that work is now being modified through a DOE and NIH grant that we received that really is focusing on what we're calling the HL3 project, which is healthy living, healthy learning, and healthy lives. So, Bill, one of the things that we're doing now is providing technical assistance to Arco Housing, which is a community housing project that owns over 1,000 units in Pittsburgh, and we're getting them to consider rethinking how they might build their units. In this particular slide I'm looking at is talking about the gateway to Westinghouse. We work with the school, Westinghouse High School, their principal and science department, to adopt right next to this, we're calling the Hold the Corner, this green lot. And we want that green lot to be a demonstration project, or we're really calling it a living lab, where we actually demonstrate plants and vegetation, bioswales, cisterns, solar panel farms, where all of these activities are on this particular plot of land that serves as a living ecosystem that really models the things we're telling kids and families that are important. And while we're doing that, we're meeting with city officials about what would it take to take this part of the community off the grid. So we've gotten a lot of support from them on this project. We've met with a number of organizations that's willing to support that. The other project is the Gateway to Phase-On, where we're looking at 4 source points of PM10 and PM2.5 air particulate matter. We're looking at dander in the homes of these houses. We're looking at remediation projects that mitigate that risk and air scrubbers that make the ambient air better. We're trying to figure out what trees could be planted that mitigate external CO2 emissions or to reduce it, and really talk with these developers about, if you're going to build something new, let's take into account these things that are contributory to people's ability to survive in these environments in a healthy way, which has pushed us to this notion of a 2-generation approach. So we based the 2-generation approach on the theory of change out of Harvard University, where it's really saying that to change an environment, it requires us to also not just change the child, but the adult. How do we create learning opportunities that allow the parent and child to embrace the benefit of sustainable community design? How does it relate to urban transition cities movements? And how do we begin to quantify and qualify the adult and student interest into how that drives policy and government in the decision-making process? And then what does it mean to promote leadership at each one of those levels and begin to hold every one of those levels accountable? So, we've talked with national best practices. We work with House on their zero energy housing model, and then we looked at this notion that what we're really saying is the race is really the prize, not the product, not the end game, but the process that we create that allows people to work together that historically have not worked together traditionally in a healthy and long-term way. So I want to pause again and ask Caroline to ask 3 questions and ask for any clarifying questions.
Yeah, and also we'll need to wrap up shortly too, Fred, and I know you're going through the slides quickly, but just want to let people know that we will be wrapping up in about 10 more minutes. And so press 1 on your keypad if you have a question or a comment, and please keep those concise if you can. And Fred, I'm not seeing anyone immediately doing that, so I think, here's one. Alice, go ahead.
Thank you. This is Alice Everett out of Miami, Florida. I thank you for taking my call. My question to you, though, is this something that we can use as a model, not just here in Miami, but I mean across the country, which obviously you have explored and been on some of those grounds, or we can use in various cities and base, I suppose, to keep it organic, as you mentioned, base it upon the political, economic structure of that particular city or location. Your model, is this something that we can use for that?
Thank you for that, Alice. I'm going to take the other person's question, then turn it back to Fred. So, Donna, please go ahead with your comment or question.
Yes, I was wondering if there was also some kind of thinking around time banking and the volunteer systems and some of the alternative bartering systems for economic development.
Great, thank you. So questions from Alice and Anna for you, Fred.
Thank you. Yes, to the second question, we're looking at time banking, bartering. We're looking at land trusts. We're working with the city on land banks, and we're really trying to figure out a way that we start to honor people's social assets and not just their cash assets. So we are looking at those, and I do think, to Alice's question, I think that what I've learned over the years of doing this work and traveling around the country and the world is that I think there's core components to everything that's transferable across geographic areas. And I think because of the typography in every city, there's certain things that you have to navigate. And some of our partners' journeys, in particular, I would say one of our partner communities we work with is in Millville, which is right across the river from us. They have a smaller governmental entity. They're more nimble than us. They've been able to take the eco districts model, for example, and get further down the road with it than we have. But we have been blessed in the past few months that the mayor's office and the special committee that has been created as a result of Pittsburgh being one of the 15 designated U.S. cities out of the 33 global cities as a 100 resilient city, there is now a specific focus on best practices and how this can be replicated. So, Alice, the answer is yes and yes. I think there are, and this is where economic gardening principles really are important, because in every city, town, or suburb, economic gardening principles are saying, in my geographical location, what are my natural assets? What are the things we have an abundance of that really we have not paid attention to? In some instances, we might have even considered to be problematic. How can we rethink those things, and how can they be comported into a different way of functioning? So when a mayor from Colorado asks, how do you work with homeless youth? How do you deal with them camping out? How do you address the local businesses being frustrated with them? One of the things that we've done here is we've solicited ways that we both encounter the challenges with opportunities. So I'm designing something now, for a better word, I'm calling a strike team. It's called the Youth Strike Team, where we'll be working with 50 youth in the city of Pittsburgh, and we'll be training 30 of them to do what I'm calling a 21st century business scan. We're going to look at all of the businesses in Homewood and walk door to door to each business and put a team of 3 students with a mentor to go into each building and discern whether or not they have an active website, whether it's live, they have some other infrastructure, has they been digitized, and all of these other things. And we really want to teach business owners and stakeholders that the youth are assets. So we want to move them off the corner. We want to move them, stop from loitering, into an active engagement process that they really begin to interface in the business in an intimate way to understand the notion of business. And what we hope occurs through this exchange is that the business owners the ones I've met with, have agreed to support this and even hire kids if it increases their bottom line. So that's one of our strategies. The other one is that we hope that as a result of this, kids and young people learn what it is to run a business and how challenging it is, and that how some of their activity unconsciously could be problematic for that business. So we're working, through a number of processes to really figure out how we can do this better. The other thing that we've done is work with these three notions of building strategic partnerships and investments by looking at talent and leadership, the economy, the economic opportunity, and creating safe and healthy environments. And we've been doing that with our local high school in a partnership. So we looked at, for example, to deal with the youth issue, we looked at the current CTE programs in the school, which is the career technology education programs at this particular school, and how we can go into the school and better partner with the school as a community organization to look at, for example, there's two businesses that want to come to Homewood to start organic food delivery and organic food development. So for that to be successful for the local high school in their CTE program, we have to go to the school and get them to tweak their model so that it has a focus on organic food development, preparation, and cooking. And what those businesses have agreed to do is do two things: both help devise the curriculum to do that, and two, help to train the students to actually have on-site experiences in the community that contextualize their academic experience. We're also working with a group we call the Junior Green Corps, and we're working with how we train up community residents and kids to retrofit their community, both through the utilization of vacant land strategies and also how that might promote organic food development in the urban setting. So we're working with Penn State, Pitt, CMU, Chatham University, really come up with methodologies and strategies to deploy these activities on the ground. And our real hope is that it promotes some partnership to create a framework for job development. And we have met with job coaches who have committed to helping out in this project, helping kids to do performas. And we've met with the banks as late as this week who are interested in supporting a business incubator for these kids. So I was trying to express to the mayor in Colorado that one of the things might be a counter-narrative is how do you create a business or a community incubator that looks at the assets of your town and looks at the abundance of youth who are homeless or camping out, and how could they help promote local business as opposed to disrupt local business? And what is our job creation model? And I'll make this very quick. All of the work I just mentioned is really about promoting self-sufficiency and creating a market. So we've been successful at training community residents in basic construction. We've leveraged that opportunity to have our students become subcontractors on projects, and because they're being pretty supportive of our endeavor, these efforts have allowed our people to grow exponentially and also increase the value of local talent, which has allowed these companies to spend less money and have a greater rate of return on investment. And I don't have time to go into more detail, but we've been successful doing that for the past 4 years to the degree that one of our partners now consult with us to pay for the services they used to pay for through other contracts. I know I'm at my time, Caroline, so tell me what's next.
Wow, thank you, Fred. I would like to give you an opportunity to do some closing thoughts, and then if you and then we'll stop the formal part of the presentation. If you can stay around for maybe 5 more minutes, if there is another burning question or two, we can take it then. How does that sound, Fred?
That sounds great.
Okay, so closing thoughts, and then again, we'll let people go, and those who want to stay and ask another few questions can.
My closing thoughts are I really appreciate the questions, Robert's, Bill's, Alice's, the mayor from Colorado, and I can't pronounce the last name, I apologize. But I think that all of the questions really resonate with me about how are we being better communicators, how are we intentionally being inclusive, and how are we willing to take risks. I'm working, there's a book that you probably might want to read that I think is a cross-section of how this might be pulled together. It's called If Mayors Ruled the World. And I'm trying to get our mayor to look at this notion of GPM, creating a global parliament of mayors, because this book really accounts that to really change systems, it's not the government that's going to do it, it's mayors. Mayors are positioned to be more nimble than the government and more bureaucratic systems because they're able to respond in a much more timely fashion. The challenge with that is that, through election cycles, people change directions, but if thought through in a very thoughtful way, mayors can really promote change in an instantaneous way that really promotes the onboarding of collective genius, because if it's connected to the economic stimulus of the community or the town or the city, then people begin to understand the value of their thinking and practice. So it's really about moving people beyond their own individual gains and losses to what does the collective gains and losses look like, and how do we really promote what Einstein would call collective genius, and what are, through economic gardening principles, are the things that we can do that really teach people what the assets are versus deficits. So I would close by saying that I think job creation is really a matter of innovation, and how do you innovate people if you don't have relationships with them? So my big thing that I'm pushing in Pittsburgh is you have to promote intentional relationships that disarm people's and bring down their barriers so that people can begin to really look at the intelligence and genius and assets of everybody, whether they have a degree or not, whether they're a researcher or not, whether they have a job or not. They are assets. And to me, that's been the reason that we've had the level of success that we have. Everybody is important. Everybody's an asset. We just have to put them in the right seat in the right bus. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Really appreciate all of your amazing work, and I can imagine that there will be a lot of people will think about this and want more information from you. So maybe you and I can figure out what might be some ways of bringing some of your models, into this greater work more. So I'm look forward to doing that.